And we're in that last section. I won't break down the entire book as far as we've come again. But we're in this section, chapters 28 through 39, where it deals with Sennacherib's invasion of Jerusalem. And at least that area. He comes in at about 701 BC. Well, in 28, we're picking up about verse 18. He calls this covenant with death and with hell. He's speaking probably about their agreement, their pact that they had made with Egypt. If not Egypt, then it's probably Assyria. But it seems to me it's probably Egypt, given the context. And anyway, he says that the people of Israel have made this agreement with a foreign nation. They look to a foreign nation rather than looking to God for aid. And so it says in verse 19, from the time that it goes forth, it shall take you. For morning by morning shall it pass over, by day and by night it shall be a vexation, only to understand the report. And then he uses this weird analogy in verse 20. The bed is shorter than a man can stretch himself on it. You ever been in that kind of bed? That's uncomfortable. Especially my parents have this one that's got a footboard and you got to really scrunch up in order to fit in there. But anyway, and the covering narrower than he can wrap himself in it. So he's got too small of a blanket. Well, that's their way of trying to patch themselves up with Egypt or Assyria. They're trying to put a Band-Aid on cancer. That doesn't work. And so in verse 21, the Lord will rise up as in Mount Perazim, and he's referencing an Old Testament event. And he'll be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work, his strange work. This is God's work. But why is it strange? See, the strange thing about it, there could be a couple of reasons. I'm inclined to think that there's one major one. Up here to the north, you've got Assyria. And then, of course, you've got down here to the south, you've got Egypt. And then right there in the middle of them, you've got Judah. And why is God calling it a strange work? Well, who did God usually use as his tool to win battles? Well, it's his people. But now God is using Assyria as his tool, so says Isaiah chapter 10, to move in against Judah. That is strange. Hold on, God, you selected us, the Israeli people, and now you're going to use Assyria, this heathen nation, people who have ravaged our people, and you're going to use them to judge us? Grab 10. Let's look back at Isaiah chapter 10. Look at this. This is Isaiah's point. And it's a complex one, but it's a good one. Somebody read Isaiah 10, 5 and 6 for us, if you don't mind. Isaiah 10, 5 and 6.
O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger and the staff in their hand is mine and indignation. I will send them against the hypocritical nation and against the people of my wrath. Will I give him a charge to take the spoil and to take the prey and to tread them down like the mere of the street, iron street.
Yes, thank you. So, Assyria? Assyria is about as wicked as they get. Why is God going to grab a hold of them and use them? Well, it says in verse 6 that he's going to send them against a hypocritical nation. Who's the hypocritical nation? It's God's people. And so God is in this affair, actually using Assyria. It looks bad. It looks dark. It looks dismal. But God is actually teaching his people. He's using Assyria to teach them the lesson they need to learn, which is trust in God, that sort of thing. See, the people of Israel were living in sin. They were living in rebelliousness. And so God has to teach them, this is not right. So he does it by means of Assyria. Even in judgment, get this point, even in judgment, God is on the side of his people. What's he trying to do? He's trying to get us to turn back. We don't like to spank our children. We don't like to send them to their rooms. And we definitely don't like to say, until you fix it, you're not getting supper. But that's what God's doing with his kids here. He's saying, look, it's time to fix this. It's time to get it right. He's not punishing them because he hates them. He's punishing them out of love. And so we've got to teach people about sin and the seriousness of it. That's what he's doing with Israel. Jump back to Isaiah 28. That's why it's strange. It's strange because God's using a wicked nation as his instrument or as his tool to teach his people what's right and what's wrong. And so in Isaiah chapter 28, in verse 22, it says, Now therefore be ye not mockers, lest your bands be made strong. I've heard from the Lord God of hosts a consumption even determined upon the whole earth. And he's speaking about a judgment that's moving in on their piece of land. Okay, in 23 through 29, you've got this parable. And it's about a farmer and his plot of land. Let's read it together. We'll read 23 through 29. Give ye ear and hear my voice. Hearken and hear my speech. Doth the plowman plow all day to sow? Not really. Does he open and break the clods of his ground? When he's made plain the face thereof, doesn't he cast abroad the fitches and scatter the cummin and cast in the principal wheat and the appointed barley and the rye in their place? Paraphrase, that's meaning, doesn't he take the seed once the ground is broken up and toss the seed into the earth? Okay, move on with me. In 26, his God instructs in the same way. He instructs him to discretion and teaches him. For the fitches are not threshed with a threshing instrument, neither is a cartwheel turned upon the cummin, but the fitches are beaten out with a staff and the cummin with a rod. Bread corn is bruised, because he'll not ever be threshing it, nor break it with the wheel of his cart, nor bruise it with his horsemen. And then it says in 29, here's the summary of the parable. This also comes forth from the Lord of hosts, which is wonderful in counsel and excellent in work. Okay, here's the point. In a modern day paraphrase. A farmer goes out into his piece of land. And what does he do? He's getting ready to plant a crop. Well, he's got to start by breaking up the ground. Well, does he spend his entire time just breaking ground? No. Once the job's done, he's got to then start planting again. And so God is in the same kind of way as this farmer. And that's Isaiah's point. He's saying God is going to tread down the nation. He's going to beat the ground out of you. But once that's happened, what's God going to do? Replenish. Replant. Once God has judged His people and taught them the lesson they need to learn, He's not just going to continue to destroy them. He's now going to help them build themselves back up. And that's the thing that God's always done with people. He's done it with you. He's done it with me. He's taught us the lessons we need to learn, and then He's giving us our second chance to say, come back home. Now, it's tough to tell. Sometimes people are taken from this world, and sometimes prematurely, and we really don't know what's going on behind the scenes. It's tough to say. But nonetheless, God has given all people an opportunity, and He continually gives us opportunities. I'm one of those, right or wrong, who believes that there will never be a person die and end up lost without having had the opportunity to be saved. I believe if we argued for such a position, it would actually be a reflection upon God. And so I believe that God has given everybody an opportunity, and there are passages to support that kind of thing, 2 Peter 3, 1 Timothy chapter 2. But Isaiah is getting at the point that Israel is getting an opportunity here. They better use it. Now, this calls to mind, this evokes a memory of a former text. Look at Isaiah 5. Hold your finger in Isaiah 29. And jump back to Isaiah 5. And somebody just read verse 7 for us. Isaiah 5:7.
For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah His pleasant plant, and He looked for judgment, but behold, oppression for righteousness, but behold, it cried.
He's calling to mind, when he uses the parable of the vineyard or the farmer again in 28, he's evoking memory back to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, he's already painted this picture where Judah's the vineyard. How do they experience it here? God tries to work with the vineyard, and it even says there at the end of 7, He looked for righteousness. He tried to survey the vineyard and see if there were righteous people in it. And then he learned, I've got to break this ground up. This is tough ground. Jeremiah uses the same kind of analogy in 4:3. Jeremiah 4:3, where he says, break up your fallow ground. Come to me with a pure, softened heart. And then, of course, you might remember those parables of our Lord, where in Matthew 13 He talks about the soils. Or in Matthew 21, where He practically reiterates Isaiah chapter 5. Constantly, this analogy is being used to teach us about how our hearts ought to be softened. And we ought to come to God in that way, rather than being a hard-hearted person and forcing God to force our hand to recognize who He is. Okay, any questions on Isaiah 28? You might have got to thinking, if you were a Jew in that time, you might have started saying, Isaiah's gone nuts. He's a radical. He's an extremist. He's one of those people who's just out to smite the nation now. But he affirms, look again at 28:29. This is from the Lord of hosts. This is His counsel. This is His working. And it's wonderful. It's excellent. The Jews could say all they wanted to about Isaiah, but nonetheless, this judgment was moving in, and there was not going to be a thing they could do to stop it, because God was the one behind the thing. Okay, look at 29:1. Woe to Ariel. That's a strange word. It means hearth or hearth, or basically it's the idea of an altar. And there are passages in your Old Testament to support this kind of thing. But what he's saying is, woe to the altar that rests in Jerusalem. Woe to Ariel, the city where David dwelt. Speaking of Jerusalem, of course. Add ye year to year. Let them kill sacrifices. That's sarcasm. He's not telling them to continue on and practicing what they're practicing. Remember in chapter 1, chapter 3, where he mocks their sacrifices. He mocks their coming to the temple. God's using sarcasm. And he's saying in 29:1, yes, continue this. Continue doing what you're doing. That makes sense. You've just witnessed in 722, your brethren have just gone captive to Assyria. And God's now going to encourage them to practice their idolatrous worship practices? No, he's using sarcasm. Yeah, kill your sacrifices. See what that does for you. No, Jerusalem, the city like animals on the altar, will be surrounded. And God's going to make the city of David now an offering. He's going to make them a sacrifice. He's going to put them on the altar, as it were. And so in 29:2, he says, I will distress the city, Ariel, the altar, Jerusalem, and there will be heaviness and sorrow. It will be unto me as Ariel, as Jerusalem, Zion. I'll camp against thee. I'll raise forts against thee, he says in verse 3. And then he says in 29:4, you'll be brought down. You'll speak out of the ground. That's a metaphor for the dead. Often in the Old Testament, you'll see somebody saying something or another about somebody speaking out of the ground. And that's how they often talk about the dead people, as though their voices still speak up from the ground. Abel, being dead yet speaking, Hebrews 11:4. So they're talking about the dead ones. You'll be as the dead people, speaking out of the ground, verse 4. You'll be as the familiar spirit, out of the ground. Your speech will be whispering out of the dust. And then he says in 29:5, moreover, the multitude of thy strangers will be like small dust. The multitude of the terrible ones will be as chaff that passes away. It will be as an instant, suddenly. This is going to be a sudden thing. Judgment's moving in. And then he says in 29:6, you'll be visited of the Lord of hosts with thunder, earthquake, great noise, storm, tempest, flame of fire. Okay, when he says that word visited, it's used two different ways. Sometimes God visits people in a positive way, as you can read in Luke chapter 1:68, Luke 1:78. But then there are other cases where the visiting of God is retribution. It's judgment. It's tough to say who's being judged here. Has he switched gears and is he saying now he's going to move in and judge Assyria and Egypt? Or is he still talking about a judgment upon Jerusalem? Tough to say. Look at verse 7. And the multitude of all the nations that fight against Ariel, even all that fight against her and her munition and that distress her, will be as a dream of a night vision. They'll be like a haunt, like a night terror or like a nightmare. And then he says in verse 8, it will be even as when a hungry man dreams, and behold, he eats, and then he awakes and his soul is still empty. So it's like a man that's getting ready to go to bed, and he wants food. He falls asleep. In the dream, he eats food, wakes up, and there's no food. Oh, isn't that sad? Well, that's how it is for Jerusalem. And they're going to be as though these people who had gone to sleep hungry, they get fed in the dream and wake up and there's no food. So judgment's moving in is the point he's making. Yeah.
Is he being literal here so that they can, when they see these things happen, they'll know? Or is he...
I think it's a figure of speech. Yeah, I think it's a metaphor. Yeah. Now that's true. Some of the things there would have been a famine at this time, and maybe that's what he's getting at too. Maybe there's a double entendre, which Isaiah frequently uses, where it has a double meaning. But I tend to think not. Anything else? Any other questions, comments? Okay, take a look at 29:8, the end of it. He drinks and he awakes, and behold, he's still faint. His soul has appetite. And then it says in verse 8, so shall the multitude of all the nations be that fight against Mount Zion. Okay, we're going to see this kind of thing happen frequently. If we were to draw it out on a timeline, God's judgment is always perfectly fair. And so if we were drawing this out on a timeline, you could pick a year to dice this all up nice and neat. Let's just say 701. And the judgment moves in. Up to the point of 701, what God is doing is He is judging Jerusalem. But once He reaches this point, and He has perfectly judged them, after that has happened, now He's no longer judging them. He's going to redeem them. So what has happened in the vision is that Israel, Judah, has experienced a perfect judgment. And that's what he's getting at in 29, 1 through 5. But in verse 6, he shifts. The judgment in the vision is pictured now as being complete. And now he's coming to bat for the people that he had just judged. And that's what he does with righteous people. Sometimes we make those mistakes, and God judges us. But once He's judged us and He's given us that opportunity, we come back to Him, hopefully. That's what righteous people do. And so that's what he's getting at. Here's a question. Let's number it off hypothetically, as though it were on a scale of 1 to 10. And this is very hypothetical, so work with me here for just a moment. But let's say that we sin a certain sin together. Let's say all of us tonight decide we're going to bring in the instrumental music into the worship center. And so God says, that's not right. We've got to sort this kind of thing out. And so let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, if we could do that, let's say God's judgment, for whatever that might be, a perfect judgment would be on the level of an 8. So if we were to number it on a scale of 1 to 10, God would say, well, a perfect judgment to meet the crime would be at the level of an 8. Could God go further and punish us to even 1 degree more than that if 8 is perfect? No. Otherwise, you've got God now being unfair or unjust in His retribution. Well, the same is true. It's always true with judgment. God, like human beings, and we don't do it perfectly, but God always gives a punishment to fit the crime. That's fairness. If we in our human fairness have that kind of thing, why wouldn't God in an eternal state have that kind of thing? See, God is a fair God. And that's what He says in the Psalm. Psalm 68, you get the point, 9. Psalm 9, verse 10, all over the place. God's a fair God. And so He works with people in a fair way. Once He has perfectly judged the nation, God's fairness kicks in once again and says, now it's time to redeem these people. Now it's time to bring them home. They've spent 70 years in Babylon and Assyria. Let's bring them home. Man, doesn't that sound familiar? Haven't you been brought back from Babylon in your own life? Where God's grabbed a hold of you and He said, you spent too long in Babylon. Come to the cross. Meet Christ. Get out of that. Yeah, that's what He did. That's why the biblical story, it continues to recur. And when Christ comes down and He drags all of these passages out of Isaiah, He's making those same points. And He's saying they're happening again. But He's not talking about Babylon that time around. He's talking about you. He's talking about me. He's talking about sin. So we look at Isaiah chapter 29, and He's doing that with the nation. Look at verse 9. Stay yourself. Stop. Wonder. Cry out. Cry. They're drunken, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. Well, what are they drunk on? What do the people become intoxicated with? What are they overrun with? An attitude. A disposition. Look at verse 10. Somebody read 10 for us. 29 verse 10.
For the Lord,
Go ahead, Luke.
For the Lord hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed your eyes. The prophets and your rulers, the seers, hath He covered.
Oh, they're not drunk on the alcohol. Well, they are. They are drunk on the alcohol as well. That's what chapter 5 said. But it's an attitude. Somebody read 13. Dewey, you've got this one. Read 29 and verse 13 for us.
Wherefore the Lord said, forasmuch as this people draw near me with their mouths and with their lips to honor me, but have removed their hearts far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men.
Imagine we all come together and we know we're sinning. We all agree we're not going to contribute to the work of the Lord this Sunday. And our songs, we're not really going to sing them out of good attitude. We all agree to this. It's a big crime before God. We all agree to it. But we leave the building and we tell everybody else with our lips, oh, we praised God this morning. The people are doing that kind of thing. Imagine coming to the temple with your fellow brother and you take the altar there and you cast the animal upon the altar with the priest. But you openly know that we're offering this before Baal. Or we're offering this before Chemosh or one of the other thugs. What a crime before God. And the people were fine with it. They honored God with their lips. They paid him lip service, but that was about it. Their hearts were far from God. And that's why he says in 10, 11, and 12 here in 29, he says, write a book. Seal this book. Let the people know these things are what I'm saying. And so in 29:14, God says, I'll proceed to do a marvelous work among this people. A marvelous work, a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid. Oh, I know who we can trust on in this crisis. He has a PhD. Oh, I know who we can trust. He's a professed wizard or sage. And they called on this kind of thing in that day. And they said, bring out the intellectuals. And God said, I'm going to work something so marvelous you won't have an intellectual left. And even the intellectual, as he said in chapter 3 of Isaiah, he said, they'll be like children. You know what the people get to the point of? They look around and they look for a leader and they can't find one, so they just pick up anybody who wears a suit. Anybody who wears a robe and looks like a priest, whether he's qualified or not, let's grab him and make him our leader. And sadly, in a lot of cases, denominational churches, and even sadly in cases, the Lord's churches are doing the same kind of thing. Oh, we don't care if he's really sound or not. Let's just grab him. He's a good speaker. Oh, he can preach to us. And he hits it off with the people. But what are we most concerned with? Truth. That's where it's at. That's where we're going for. And Isaiah is trying to get the people to think about that in his own day. In 29:15, God delivers through Isaiah a woe. Woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord. Let's not let the Lord know our plan. And their works are in the dark. And they say, well, who really sees us? Who knows our plan? Who knows our plot? In verse 16, the text says, surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as the potter's clay. For shall the work say of him that made it, he made me not? Imagine a jar opening its mouth and saying, oh, he didn't make me. You get the idea. Nonsense. Well, that's what the people are doing. They're the tool. They're the instrument. And they're saying of God, he didn't make us. We did this all on our own. Fools are we if we say that kind of thing. And so he says in 16, what about the thing that's been framed? Does it really make the claim, well, the person who made me didn't have any understanding? 17. Is it not yet a very little while, and Lebanon will be turned into a fruitful field? The fruitful field will be esteemed as a forest. He's talking about the changing over of the land. In a latter text, okay, let me work with this for a moment. Once the 701 judgment hits, God says, it's time for my people to come back home. We've got to get the people back with me. So far, their hearts have been removed. They pay lip service. They worship idols. They're alcoholics. All that sort of thing in the chapters we've been working with. And so in Isaiah's text, God says, but once the judgment comes, let's bring them home. Often it is the case, in the Old Testament especially, and then John in the book of Revelation, 2 Peter 3 picks up on this kind of thing. It is the case that the land, how the land is described, is how the people are described. Back here, when they're living wickedly, this is an era of wickedness. Well, what's the land described as here? Oh, it's described as a wilderness. It's described as overrun with famine, drought. The beasts overtake it. You can read all of this in Jeremiah 14. But the land's undergoing a persecution. All of this is very metaphorical. It's all very poetic or very figurative. But what's God going to say then when he says it's time for us to bring our people home in 701? Look at what he says again in verse 17. He says, isn't Lebanon, this land that had been a wilderness, it had been desolate, it had no fruit coming forward? He says, isn't Lebanon going to be turned back into a fruitful field? Won't this fruitful field be esteemed as though the whole forest is flourishing again? In Ezekiel 36, describing this kind of thing, the return of the people. In Ezekiel 36, he says, your land's going to be the Garden of Eden. Oh, not literally. He's speaking to them about blessing coming back. And then later, when we get to the end of Isaiah's text, we're going to see in 65 and 66, the last 2 chapters of the book, we're going to see God talking about their redemption back from the captivity as a new heavens and new earth. He's not talking about some end-time thing. He's talking about redemption from the captivity. And there are arguments all over for that, as we'll see when we get there. But in 29:17, he's telling them, you've undergone oppression. Let me be your Redeemer. Let me call you back home. Sometimes the New Testament texts make usage of these texts. And they start to say that these things that happened in Isaiah are happening again. What are the New Testament writers doing? They're giving them a new application. They're giving them a new situation. It's the same redemption, new faces, new people, new places. And in a lot of ways, God uses this kind of language to speak to you and me. He's talking about not redemption from Babylon or Assyria, but he's talking about redemption from sin. And that's what Paul does in 2 Corinthians 5 and elsewhere. When he says all things are made new. Well, what's he talking about? The person who's just entered Christ. Same kind of language, same kind of echo, as you could see even if you had compared the language. 29:18. In that day, when God redeems the people, the deaf will hear the words of the book. Not literally. He's talking about a day coming in which, wouldn't that be great? He's just preaching to them now. He's just preaching about a day where everything's set how it should be. And the eyes of the blind, verse 18, they're actually going to see again. In verse 19, the meek will increase their joy in the Lord. The poor among men will, rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. The terrible one, the oppressor, whomever he may be. He's not thinking of a specific one. But Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, all of these guys fit the bill. And so he says the terrible one is brought to naught. The scorner is consumed. All that watch for iniquity are cut off. Why? That make a man an offender for a word, and lay a snare for him that reproveth in the gate, and turn aside the just for a thing of naught. All of the people who have been doing wickedness are going to be brought low in this day of judgment, and all of the people who have been trying to do right are going to be uplifted. And then he says in 22, here's what the Lord says, and look at who he appeals to. Who redeemed, who is it? Abraham. Well, what was it that God had said to Abraham? Father Abraham, you sing that song now.
He was going to give them a lot of sons.
A lot of sons? There's a lot there. There's a lot that he promised. So you're not wrong, but he did say that. Nation, people, I'll make your name great. In thee shall what?
All the nations be blessed.
All the nations of the earth be blessed. In this day, God's going to be who God is. And the people are going to see him for who he is. It's through God, it's through Jehovah that all nations will be blessed. And so he says in 22, the Redeemer has come. He's coming. The same one that promised to Abraham concerning the house of Jacob. Jacob's not going to be ashamed of his God. He's going to put his faith in God. We've got to read. Somebody read 28. 28:16.
Therefore thus saith the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion where a foundation of stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation, and he that believeth shall not make haste.
The believer, the one who puts his stock in God, the Old Testament text says here in our English text, shall not make haste. When Paul quotes this passage in Romans, he works it this way. He that believeth shall not be ashamed. When the day comes that God is who He is, and He stands up for the nations, and He vindicates Israel and Judah and the righteous remnant, and He goes to bat for them, and all of the righteous people see God, look at what our text said again in 29, in verse 22. Jacob's not going to be ashamed. They're not going to fear anymore. And they're not going to try to reach out to Egypt or Assyria and say, well, that's who we trusted in. No, this time they're going to say, and rightfully so, God redeemed us. And that's what God's trying to get us to do as well. Don't be ashamed. Put our trust, put our faith in Him, and be open about it. And so He says, neither shall his face now wax pale. Maybe Christ grabs hold of this. Remember what He said in Mark 8:38? Oh, we better get that one. Let's read Mark 8:38. Whoever's got it, go ahead. Mark chapter 8. And then, just read verse 38.
Whosoever therefore shall be ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him also shall the Son of Man be ashamed, when He cometh in the glory of His Father with the holy angels.
It sounds similar, doesn't it? Maybe Christ is getting at the point. You remember Isaiah's day? Remember when the Jews were ashamed of God? And so they turned to a different king, Pharaoh Necho, Sennacherib. Remember how that panned out for them? Oh, it was good, God. We won the victory. No, you spent 70 years in captivity. Christ says there's another day like that coming. It's not going to be in Isaiah's day. But in that day when I come, He says, and I ride in on the clouds and I make a judgment. The people who have been ashamed of me, what's going to happen? The Son will be ashamed of them when He comes in power with great glory. Okay, jump back to Isaiah then. In Isaiah 29, then, we're closing out the chapter here. He says in verse 23, but when He sees His children, the work of mine hands, God says, in the midst of Him, they will sanctify my name. They'll sanctify the Holy One of Jacob. They'll fear the God of Israel. That's who's being glorified. And then He says in 24, they also that erred in spirit shall come to understanding, and they that murmured shall learn doctrine. Okay, look at chapter 30 then. Woe to the rebellious children. That's never good. He called them that back in chapter 1. Woe to these rebels, says the Lord, that take counsel. Oh, that's good. They're looking for wisdom. Yeah, but it's not of God, the text says. And they cover. They're trying to get rid of their sin. Well, that's good, isn't it? Yeah, but it's not of God's Spirit that they're doing this. They're actually looking for redemption. They're looking for a Savior in any place except for God. You know people like that? You know people in your personal lives that you run into at work that they'll look for anything to do to be saved, but they don't want to hear from the Church of Christ. They'll look for anything to say that we love God, but they're not going to listen to the Bible. They'd much rather say something about the Holy Spirit telling them something that's non-biblical than they would to appreciate the biblical text. The people of Isaiah's day were doing the same thing. Well, in 30 in verse 2, that walked, these people walked and they went down into Egypt. And they asked for counsel, but it wasn't at God's mouth. And they were trying to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh and to trust in the shadow of Egypt. We've said enough about that already. Therefore shall the strength of Pharaoh be your shame, the trust in the shadow of Egypt, your confusion. His princes were at Zoan. His ambassadors came to Hanes. He's not talking about underwear or t-shirts there. My, if they had trusted in that, wouldn't that have been sorry? He came to the fruit of the looms. Verse 5. They were all ashamed of a people that could not profit them, nor being help nor profit, but a shame and also a reproach. The burden of the beasts of the south, into the land of trouble and anguish, from whence come the young, the old lion, both of them, the viper and the fiery flying serpent. They will carry their riches upon the shoulders of young donkeys, asses, and their treasures upon the bunches of camels, to a people that shall not profit them. The Egyptians shall help in vain and to no purpose. There's the key. Look at the end there. The end of the paragraph is verse 7. And look how verse 7 reads. Their whole going after Pharaoh and Egypt will be purposeless. Nothing's going to happen. They're going to turn to the wrong people. And we do the same thing sometimes. Life really hits the fritz, and so we turn to the bank account and just find out that the bank account doesn't fix some problems. Drew, you may have a lot of money, but that doesn't really repair cancer. You start to put trust in family. Man, family's good. But maybe family is coming from poverty and in your case you need money. Where do we turn in these things? You've got to turn to the one who's given us all. It's God. And they turn to Egypt. Egypt has money. Egypt has horses. Egypt has chariots. They'll help us out. No, Egypt failed. And so in verse 7 it says, "Therefore I cried concerning this. Their strength is to sit still." This is a title. We haven't really gotten to a whole lot of these texts yet. But this is a name. It means Egypt the quieted. Egypt the still one. Or as I like what, there's a certain translation out there that's a paraphrase, and they render it, Egypt should be called the dragon that does nothing. They turn to a dragon, and his name is Dragon Do Nothing. Egypt's going to help us. Egypt's going to be the one we can trust in. Egypt failed. And so in verse 8, "Now go, write this in a table, note it in a book, that it may be for the time to come forever and ever." What does he mean by that? He says this is eternal. Are we still looking for this kind of thing in our future? Depends on what you mean. No, in that Egypt's not going to rise up like they were in this time. But yes, the same principle is still effective today. What's the principle? When we put our trust in something other than God, it's going to be fruitless. And that's what he's getting at. Look at verse 9. "This is a rebellious people, lying children, children that won't hear the law of the Lord. They say to the seers, the prophets, see not. They say to the prophets, prophesy not unto us right things." Oh, I heard of a preacher once who ran into an eldership and basically did that in his interview. They asked him about whether or not he'd preach on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. The guy's name was Andrew Connolly. He said, "Oh, brethren, I know you wouldn't ask me to do that." They did. They asked him not to preach truth on the issue. My. And then it says they rather would have them speak smooth things and prophesy the deceits. No need to turn there, but remember what Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:3 and 4. "The time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. They'll heap to themselves teachers," because they have itching ears. They want to hear good preaching, not doctrinal preaching. And they'd rather hear a fable than the truth. That last sentence is paraphrased. That's what they're doing in Isaiah's day. And so he says in verse 11, "Get out of the way. Get out of the path. Get out of here, holy God of Israel. We don't want to hear truth." And so they say in verse 12, this is what God's response is. "You despise this word. You trust in oppression. You trust in perverseness. You stay thereon. You put your hold in Egypt." He says in verse 13, "This iniquity will be on you as a breach ready to fall, swelling out in a high wall, whose breaking comes suddenly at an instant." Remember, concrete cracks every once in a while. And he says, you really can't stop that. One day you look and there's the crack. It started and you can't do anything about it. That's how Israel's going to be. Their iniquity has started to cause a crack in their wall, and there's nothing they're going to do to fix it. And so he says in verse 14, "He'll break it as the breaking of the potter's vessel that's broken in pieces. There won't be found in the bursting of it assured to take fire from the hearth or to take water from without of the pit." And here's what the holy God of Israel says in verse 15. "In returning and in rest will you be saved." Coming back to God will save the nation, not Egypt, not Assyria. And so he says in verse 16, "You said, no, we won't trust in God. We'll flee upon horses." No, horses won't do it. And then they say in verse 17, 1,000 will flee at the rebuke of one. At the rebuke of 5 will you flee. Basically, when we start to see the attack coming and Assyria has surrounded, then we'll decide to get out of Dodge. Not going to happen. Too late. Assyria is going to move in. And when they're standing there saying, "Assyria can't judge us, we're God's people," God's going to knock on the door of Jerusalem and say, "I'm working through Assyria." And all because they wouldn't come back to God by faith. Verse 18, "Therefore will the Lord wait." So here you have that turn again, where now God's standing up for the people. "And He's going to be gracious unto you. And therefore will He be exalted." Look, somebody get 40:31. This ties the words together. 40 verse 31. We sing this song. Whoever's got it, go ahead.
be weary unless you're walking off faith.
Next time you can sing it for us. Okay. The word wait, he's going for the idea of trust, or put your faith in. Isn't it a good thing? You know, we have this view of God where it's a tough thing to get away from. And you've got to appreciate it. But we have this view of God where it's like we've got to do it all. Where we've got to take the burden and put it on our shoulders. And we've got to trust in God. And we've got to be the ones to make sure our faith is right where it needs to be. And all of that's true. We've got to do our part. But the text we're working in here in chapter 30, it's not us who's doing the waiting. It's God. He's meeting us in the middle. Isn't it a good thing to know that not only do we need to put our faith in God, but He needs to put His faith in us? The Lord is trusting the righteous people to be righteous. See, the Lord has confidence in you. He has confidence in me. He's trying to get us to realize that we're not doing this alone. We feel alone sometimes, and we feel like, I just can't make it through the day. And I just don't know what to do in this situation. Yeah, I don't have a better answer than to just simply say, God's helping you do it. And whatever you've got going on, whatever I've got going on, you're not to expect some miraculous result where God steps in and He starts to fix it all up nice and neat. That's not what He's going for. But isn't it good to know that whatever happens, God's with us every step of the way, trying to help us make it to heaven? Sometimes we get that idea where it's, we've got to do it, we've got to get to heaven. And that's great, that's true. But what about from God's perspective where He's saying, I've got to get these people to heaven. I've got to make sure that Drew goes to heaven. And we've got somebody there holding our hand every step of the way. That's what He's getting at. And so He says in 18, He's going to be the one that's exalted. Whatever happens with you and whatever happens with me, God's going to be glorified in the affair. So use yourself as a tool to glorify God. He's going to have mercy upon you. The Lord, He's a God of judgment. That's true. So He judges wickedness. But what about when you're right? Isn't it good to know that there's a day coming where God's going to take vengeance on those who have done the raping, on those who have done the murdering, on those who have been thieves? Isn't it good to know that there's that kind of God that's on your side, not mine? That's what Isaiah is getting at. God, that kind of Redeemer is the one who's working for us. And so he says in 30, in verse 19, the people will dwell in Zion at Jerusalem. No more tears. God's bringing you home. You're coming out of Assyria. No more tears. We'll pick up there next week. Any closing comments or questions? Okay, we'll pick up in 30:19 next week.